Alright, so E3 is just a day away, and Microsoft is planning to finally unveil the name of Project Scorpio and its price. Project Scorpio is Microsoft's mid-generation refresh of the Xbox One, which is similar to how the PlayStation 4 Pro is the mid-generation refresh to the PlayStation 4. Like the PS4 Pro, Project Scorpio will play original Xbox One games, and all games released for Project Scorpio will also work on the Xbox One. Now, not everyone is enamored with the mid-generation refreshes. Some think that because they don't have any exclusive games unto themselves, that it makes them not really worth getting at the extra price over the base consoles. Others think that because the games also have to work on the original Xbox One and PS4, that any increase in power these new consoles have is pretty much wasted, since the original consoles will hold the newer consoles back. And I can't say they're completely wrong, as there is some validity in these thoughts. Others, though, are very enamored with the new consoles. They see the new consoles and their extra power as a way to get the most out of console games. Some of them see the mid-generation refreshes as a reason to not have to worry about a high-end PC being something to look at with envy. Again, there is some validity to these thoughts as well. Then there are the fanboys, who feel that each of these mid-generation consoles will absolutely crush the other console, and show the world just how big their internet dicks are for supporting these consoles with such fervor. These fanboys will never be swayed to believe that there is anything the other console might be doing better, or that there may be flaws with their favorite console. So when listening to them, there's very little validity to their arguments. In this video, I will go over what I feel the pros and cons are for the mid-generation refreshes, and what I hope that these consoles will mean for the future of console gaming. Both Sony and Microsoft are really pushing the 4K aspect of each console. Now in Sony's case, this is a fairly obvious thing for them to want to push, since they produce and sell 4K TVs. So they have a dual business desire in pushing the 4K marketing on the PS4 Pro. By selling PS4 Pros, they can hope that buyers of the PS4 Pro will also be inclined to buy a Sony-manufactured 4K TV to get the most out of the console. Microsoft, on the other hand, seems to be pushing 4K resolution more to ensure that resolution gate doesn't happen again, like when the PS4 and the Xbox One first launched, and it was discovered that more games hit 1080p on the PS4 than the Xbox One. Because Microsoft's Project Scorpio actually has a decent performance advantage over the PS4 Pro by almost 2 teraflops, they want to try to show just what this performance leap over the PS4 Pro, and the original Xbox One Project Scorpio actually means. If they can have more games that render at a native 4K than the PS4 Pro, Resolution Gate 2 will happen between fanboys, just in the opposite direction. However, the big problem with pushing the 4K aspects of the mid-generation console refreshes is that the actual adoption rate of 4K TVs in the US is very low right now. At present, it is sitting at around 15% of US homes having a 4K TV, with that adoption rate predicted to take until the end of 2019 to even hit 50%. So while the PS4 Pro and Project Scorpio can hit 4K resolution, the actual amount of people able to take the full advantage of that higher resolution is fairly small, and will remain a minority for the foreseeable future. Now, even with the 4K aspect not being able to be achieved by many gamers right now, there are still benefits to console gamers who are, or who will be on these systems, that still game at 1080p, which is the majority of console gamers right now. The first and biggest advantage is super sampling. The consoles could render games at a higher resolution, such as 1440p, 1800p, or native 4K, and then downsample the output resolution to 1080p. This helps with aliasing and texture quality in the final output of the games. This will help to make games running on a 1080p screen look much better than they would have if they were just rendered at the native 1080p. The benefits of super sampling are already known in the PC gaming scene, and I experience it in some of my own PC games as well. While being able to render at 1080p at PC max settings is still extremely good looking on the PC, for those games where I can actually do the same at 4K super sampled down to output to my 1080p 144Hz monitor, they look even better. Granted, I don't have a ton of games that can do this right now, because my GTX 980 Ti isn't always powerful enough to do that. But if I were to upgrade to a 1080 Ti, then every single game I have on the PC could potentially be able to be rendered at a native 4K, and then downsampled to the final output of 1080p, with only a few exceptions. Another advantage is something that some games on the PS4 Pro are already doing. allow for different modes at native 1080p. Rise of the Tomb Raider, for example, has a 30 FPS native 1080p mode, with the visuals upgraded to have better anti-aliasing, better particle effects, and other filters that improve the visual quality. It also has a 1080p performance mode, where it uses the base visuals but allows for a higher frame rate. Final Fantasy XV also has a 1080p unlocked frame rate mode. Now, I don't expect every game to have these sorts of modes, but it would be nice if some games did offer this when playing on the PS4 Pro or Project Scorpio on a 1080p TV. Developers could also work to just increase the frame rates on their games if they decide to keep them at a lower than 4K resolution, natively. Having more games running at 60 FPS would be a great thing in the console space, and is something that is sorely lacking. Finally, there's the benefit of better hardware being able to help older games that were released on both the PS4 and the Xbox One. Now, this doesn't mean that a game designed to run at 30 FPS is suddenly going to run at 60 FPS, simply because the mid-gen consoles have more power than their older siblings. However, it does mean that older games that do not get a patch to run on the new consoles should see a few benefits. First, many games on the PS4 and Xbox One use dynamic resolution scaling, where the game will scale to a lower resolution at times to keep the frame rate closer to the targeted frames per second. So using the power of the mid-gen refreshes, they should be able to hit the higher resolution more often than not. Second, while the games target a certain frame rate, they often don't always hit those frame rates. So the mid-gen consoles can use their higher power to help those games to reach their targeted frame rates more often. It's impossible to say that they'll always hit their resolution or frame rate targets, but if they can hit their targets more often, it will help those older games. Now, on the PS4 Pro, this was not enabled by default at its launch. The boost mode for the PS4 Pro was added in a post-launch patch. Unfortunately, the actual performance of the games not patched for the PS4 Pro is a bit hit or miss. Some games apparently benefit greatly from the feature, while others only see a bare minimum performance gain. Microsoft is saying there's no boost mode that must be enabled on Project Scorpio, and that it will just always be active. However, since the console hasn't been released, we don't actually know how much of a benefit, if any, it will bring to different games. It would be nice if it works as promised out of the box, but at this point it is a wait-and-see affair. When news of the mid-console generation refreshes started being known, many people brought up how it seems to be very similar to the way smartphones operate. Incremental upgrades that offer more than the previous version, but are still compatible with the older software. An obvious example is the iPhone, with its numbered versions and then the S versions. Apple makes small advances on the S version, and then does a larger advance on the next numbered version. We could also look at it in the PC graphics card market with NVIDIA's normal cards, and then the TI cards that come out before the next major upgrade. The 980 Ti was an improvement over the 980, but not as big of a leap as the 1080 was. And the 1080 Ti is another improvement over the 1080, but that will be eclipsed when NVIDIA releases the 1180, or whatever they're going to call the next major release. In the console market, this is the first time we've seen similar product refreshes. Sure, we've seen the PS2 Slim, the PS3 Slim, the Xbox 360 Slim, the PS4 Slim, and the Xbox One S, but they weren't any sort of real leap forward for the consoles, though the Xbox One S does have a very slight upgrade over the original Xbox One. With the PS4 Pro and Project Scorpio, we're actually seeing actual hardware improvements over the original consoles, while still being considered part of the same generation. Both the PS4 Pro and Project Scorpio have faster CPUs and more powerful GPUs than the original consoles, but are still able to play games released for the original consoles. And, as of now, both Sony and Microsoft have stated there won't be any PS4 Pro or Project Scorpio exclusive games that won't be on the original consoles. Though I have a feeling that might change for Project Scorpio with any potential virtual reality games, as the base Xbox One simply cannot handle VR games. In the past, we've mainly seen consoles release all new generations of hardware, often with the new consoles being incompatible with the games on the previous hardware. The Nintendo Entertainment System games were incompatible with the Super Nintendo, the Sega Master System games were incompatible with the Genesis, etc. One of the selling points of the PlayStation 2, though, was the fact that it was backwards compatible with the original PlayStation. And while the PS3 was originally backwards compatible with the PS2, that was removed in the PS3 Slim console to save money, since the backwards compatibility was actually done by putting the PS2's Emotion engine into the PS3. At launch, both the PS4 and the Xbox One were not backwards compatible, though Microsoft has been working to remedy this with software emulation and a growing library of backwards compatible games. Now, whether one wants to argue that the sheer power increase from the Xbox One to Project Scorpio, in both graphics and system memory, warrant calling it a generational leap is subjective. The fact remains that all games released for Project Scorpio will work on the Xbox One, again with the possible exception of any VR games that might arise in the future. It's the same for the PS4 Pro and the PS4. And again, one could argue that the power increase between the Pro and the PS4 isn't as big of a jump since the RAM stayed the same with some extra added for the OS, and the architecture of the CPU is the same, just with a faster speed, and the GPU is essentially two PS4 GPUs working in tandem. So how does this look for a possible PS5 and next Xbox? Well, there are already rumors that Sony is planning on talking about, if not completely unveiling, a PS5 console at E3 this year for a possible release as early as 2018. Though personally, with the release of the PS4 Pro only a few months old, I think it would be foolish for them to do so. The Pro hasn't found its footing yet, and releasing a PS5 within 2 years of the Pro would very possibly create a backlash. However, we have to remember that this is precisely how Apple does things with the iPhone. A numbered release, the S version the next year, and then the next numbered the year after that. So if the smartphone-style upgrade path is being followed by Sony, it could happen. I find it highly unlikely, but it could happen. At this point, everything I'm going to talk about with the possible relation to console generations is pure speculation on my part. First off, obviously we could see a complete generational leap from both Sony and Microsoft in the future. Though if it's any sooner than 3 years from the release of their mid-gen refreshes, I think the backlash from customers and developers would be enormous. Console players are used to console generations lasting around 5 years, with the Xbox to Xbox 360 being only 4 years, but the Xbox 360 to Xbox One was 8 years, and the PS3 to PS4 was 7 years. Developers also need time to make games that take advantage of the PS4 Pro and Project Scorpio, so suddenly announcing a new generation with an entirely different architecture, with the rumor stating it could be releasing as soon as next year, would throw developers into chaos, if not outright rebellion. As it stands, the PS4 Pro has been out for about 6 months, and very few games really take advantage of it, even Sony first-party games like Uncharted 4 and Horizon Zero Dawn. One would assume their own first-party studios would have had access to development kits earlier than third parties, so while we should expect third parties to be a bit behind in taking full advantage of the hardware, seeing that even Sony first-party studios haven't yet been able to take advantage of the hardware fully is a bit of an issue. Now imagine a brand new piece of hardware with a completely different architecture announced this year for release next year. Any studios who have done work on the PS4 Pro versions of games will also need to be setting up for new hardware and switching development from the PS4 and the PS4 Pro to the PS5, with very little time to get everything together. Now, we may see this sort of hardware generational upgrade, but if it does happen, I think the best way would be to not even announce a new console until at least 3 years after the release of the mid-generation upgrades. This would make this generation be at least 6 years long, which would have the customers and developers far more ready for a new machine. And even so, we'd probably see what happened with this generation, where for the first year and a year and a half to 2 years, games are released for both the new generation and the current one, to take advantage of the install base of the PS4 and the Xbox One, until the next generation of consoles gets its footing and install base. In my opinion, though, there is a far better way to do this, in a way that would have still followed the smartphone paradigm, if that's what Sony and Microsoft want to be following, but that also exists already in the PC market. The PS4, PS4 Pro, Xbox One, and Project Scorpio are all using x86 architecture for their CPUs. They're tied far more closely to PCs than most previous consoles because of this. And using the x86 architecture also means they can follow a similar upgrade path as the PC market, just at a slower pace. It is also similar to the smartphone market, which also tends to be tied to a set processor architecture. This upgrade path is to simply stay with the x86 architecture, like the PC market, and make the next major consoles release more powerful, while not forcing developers to have to learn an all-new type of hardware configuration. By sticking with an x86 design, the next versions of the consoles will have many benefits. First, backwards compatibility is pretty much assured. Right now, I can load up a bunch of old games on my PC and they run just fine. We're talking, in some cases, games that had a minimum requirement of a Pentium 90, 16 megabytes of system RAM, ran on DirectX 5, and were released in 1995. While there have been advances in PC hardware, the base of the CPUs used is still an x86. Whether you're running an i3, i5, i7, Athlon, or the newest Ryzen release, the architecture is still x86. With very few exceptions, anything that was made to run on an x86 processor back in the day will still be able to run on today's x86 processors. Second, developers already know how to develop for the x86 architecture. There's no real learning curve needed to get games out on newer hardware if the basics of the machine are the same as the previous generation. Even if Sony were to drop their version of OpenGL on the PS5 in favor of Vulkan, developers already know how to develop for Vulkan as well. In short, the development of games won't be hindered by having to learn the hardware. The hardware is already known. Sure, its specific implementation and use might not be exactly PC-like, or even exactly as it was on the older console, but that's a speed bump to get over when developing, not a huge hurdle. This ease of development would be a boon not just for large publishers and their studios, but also for small independent studios. By sticking with the x86 architecture, they could also follow the normal upgrade path of CPUs. So, in a few years, they could announce a new console using a version of Ryzen, for example. Maybe not the very newest version at the time, obviously, since that would increase the cost, but perhaps a Ryzen chip out now or soon in the future, say a year or so. This way, they get the benefit of a faster CPU while keeping the cost to manufacture relatively low, and the benefit of backwards compatibility and ease to develop for mentioned earlier. The same goes for the GPU. In a few years, Vega will have been released, and perhaps even the next step beyond Vega by AMD. So both Sony and Microsoft could implement a Vega GPU into their next consoles. Now here's where it falls into the smartphone paradigm. Let's say they release a new version of their consoles in 3 to 4 years. By then, the price to manufacture the PS4 Pro and Project Scorpio will be reduced significantly. We could see both consoles selling for $250 by then, maybe even less. At that point, they announce the new iteration of the consoles and state that the PS4 Pro and Project Scorpio will still get all games made for the new consoles, just scaled back to those consoles' abilities. At that point, they could say that the original PS4 and the Xbox One won't always get the newest games, that the PS4 Pro and Project Scorpio are now the base models. But Sam, you say, that's not how smartphones work. Actually, it is. Every few iterations of smartphones, older hardware is essentially end-of-lifed. The newest OS won't work on them, either Android or iOS, and many newer apps also won't work on the older hardware or their older OS versions. Someone still rocking an iPhone 3 can't run the newest version of iOS, nor any programs that require that OS or at least specific hardware to run. The same for Android. My G1, Nexus 1, and Galaxy Nexus can't run the newest versions of Android my Nexus 6 can, and my Nexus 6 will probably be left behind in the next year or so as the Pixel 2 and beyond get released. Now, while smartphones tend to not advance to the point where only one generation old is the oldest supported anymore, we have to remember that smartphones generally release every year. Releasing a new console every year is financial suicide. But by releasing new iterations every 3 to 4 years, those with the older console still get games for another 3 to 4 years, and eventually get phased out for newer games being released. But by then, the console owner is probably ready for the newest, or at least newer hardware. It's not dissimilar to the way console generations work now if you think about it, except under this plan, your games are always forward compatible. Sure, it's not like a game released in 2013 on the consoles is suddenly going to get a fresh graphical facelift. But your games also keep working on the newest hardware, just like a PC. A PC built today isn't necessarily going to be able to run games or even the OS released in a few years' time. Even my brother's PC, built 3 or so years ago, is at the tail end of minimum requirements for many games being released today, at least GPU-wise. And it was a pretty damn good machine when he built it. Not quite top of the line, but damn close. It happens with all technology. A 5 or so year old TV that breaks is probably easier and cheaper to replace rather than repair, because barely anyone has the parts and the labor costs get pretty outrageous. The same for stereos, kitchen appliances, washers and dryers, etc. About the only thing that keeps going and keeps having parts made for it, for a good chunk of what's out there, are cars and motorcycles. Everything else out there becomes obsolete. It's a fact of life in our technological world. So having consoles become end of life after 2 newer iterations comes out isn't the end of the world. Especially since that would mean each iteration would be supported for, say, 6 to 8 years. Plus, if they follow this strategy, older games will keep working on them anyway. No more having to dust off and hook up an older console or get an emulator on your PC if you just want to play a game released originally on the PS4 or Xbox One. The same with peripherals, to the point where they could sell 2 versions of the consoles, one that comes with a controller and one that doesn't, for those who already have controllers from the previous iterations. For example, I already have an Xbox One Elite controller, so unless Project Scorpio comes with a better controller, which I find unlikely since the Elite controller is awesome, I don't need a controller to come with the system. I'll just be using my Elite controller. So if they were to release a no controller version for, say, $50 less than the one that comes with the controller, I'd go for that. Some might think this brings the console market too close to the PC market, but I think that's actually a good thing. Games could be developed simultaneously by the same team for the PC and consoles. And if the consoles are essentially just low-power PCs compared to the then-current PC market, then all it takes is scaling back to fit that hardware. It means faster and cheaper game development for all studios, big and small. Sure, there would be some console-specific optimization for each piece of hardware, but that's a very small part of the development process. In the end, this would be a huge boon to developers and customers alike. The development process would be streamlined between the consoles and the PC, and customers would be assured that they'd be getting games on the hardware they just bought for a decent amount of time before needing to upgrade to either the new base model or to the higher end model. There are some arguments going on online about parity between the PS4 Pro and Project Scorpio. There are people arguing that there should be no differences based on the power of the hardware between the two consoles. I find this ironic because many of those same people were the ones saying there should be no parity if the PS4 can render the same game at a higher resolution than the Xbox One. But now the power shoe is going to be on the other foot. My own thoughts on this is simple. No, there should be no parity. Even though I'm sure to save time and money on development, there will end up being parity. We've seen it before with the PS2 and the OG Xbox. Even though the OG Xbox could produce better graphics than the PS2, most developers simply ported their PS2 versions of games to the OG Xbox, with few, if any, enhancements. I expect the same for the PS4 Pro and Project Scorpio, honestly. Most third-party developers will make the PS4 Pro version the, quote, baseline, and then port that over to Project Scorpio with few, if any, enhancements, despite Project Scorpio's obvious power advantage over the PS4 Pro. We also see it on the PC side, with the PC versions of games also on consoles often seemingly hindered to have parity between the versions. Whether this is a frame rate parity, graphical quality parity, or whatever, it happens, and it's annoying. There should be no parity in my mind. The PC version of the game should be the baseline, and then the console version should be scaled back to fit their hardware. Let the developers decide on the recommended specs for the PC version, and then scale up and down from there. PC players are already used to not playing on equal footing with each other. People with older or lower-end hardware simply can't get the resolution or frame rate of people with newer or high-end hardware. And that's fine. PC players have been dealing with it for a long time, and they're fine with it. There's no reason that there should be parity between what the PC versions are capable of and what the consoles are capable of. Just like there should be no parity on the console side. If the PS4 can run a game at a better resolution than the Xbox One, then so be it. If Project Scorpio can run a game at a better native resolution than the PS4 Pro, then so be it. Let the customer base decide where they buy the game, be it PC or their choice of console. Calling for parity because one doesn't want the version of the game, same third-party game, to be running better on the other console or PC is pretty childish. And it's also very petty. If you prefer playing on the PlayStation consoles, then play on the PlayStation consoles. The same for the Xbox consoles. There's going to be people who prefer to play on the PC too, and that's fine. The PC version should be the very best version in terms of resolution, textures, and frame rates when running on a machine of recommended specs. Period. By not having parity, it forces the console manufacturers to work harder to bring the best bang for the buck in designing newer consoles. They want our business. Let's make them earn it. And that about does it for this video. E3 is pretty much tomorrow by the time most of you will see this. So I'll hopefully be doing some post-E3 videos and maybe even some major press release conference videos as well. We'll see. I have to be ready for surgery at the end of the month, so I can't promise that I'll have the time to really be making a lot of videos before then or directly after as I recover. But what do you think? Am I too far off base on my thoughts? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for taking the time to watch my video. If you liked it, please hit the like button. If you didn't, hit the dislike button. Either way, I'm good. Also, if you enjoyed the video and wish to help support in making more, consider visiting my Patreon page located in the description below. And again, thank you very much.